Welcome back to the final episode of She Bangs, Marriage, Adultery, Texas, and Jesus. By now you should know that I am Jennifer Bangs, the host of this podcast. You can find it on any podcast place. You can find it on my website, shebangs.com. This is the final episode, guys. I don't really know what else to say. So grab a glass of whiskey and welcome to the final episode of She Bangs, Marriage, Adultery, Texas, and Jesus.
Oh, she bangs, I'm wasted by the way she moves. No one ever looks so fine. She reminds me that a woman's got one thing on her mind.
Welcome back to She Bangs, Marriage, Adultery, Texas, and Jesus, a totally spiritual, equally foul-mouthed podcast about marriage, mistresses, and possibilities. I'm your host, Jennifer Bangs. It's been a while. My apologies to my listeners I left hanging after episode 9. A lot's been going on personally and nationally, right? I've been driving much of my efforts towards my new podcast, She Bangs, for God and Country. It's a real-time current events podcast that maintains my Southern charm and Yankee mouth. If you like or don't like politics for that matter, you may like this podcast. I tend to be pretty bipartisan. I mean, I guess you have to be if you've been a wife and a mistress. You tend to see both sides of the coin. And so it's an unusual perspective I take on things affecting our country. So when this story is done, come on over and listen to She Bangs for God and Country. I also want to give a little marketing plug for my podcast, y'all. I don't ask for money right now, and I don't have advertisers right now because right now, this is a creative gift. Therefore, would you gift me in 2 ways? Number 1, spreading the word on this podcast. And number 2, taking a moment to give me 5 stars on whatever platform you're listening. Most people listen through iTunes, and their review system is super simple. If you would give me stars for the entire podcast or individual episodes or both, it would be much appreciated. I'll just go ahead and wait for you while you do that. Just kidding. Okay, spread the word, please. I want to get my story out to as many people as possible, and if you've enjoyed my story so far, share it. I'll also be touring with this show, She Bangs, Marriage, Adultery, Texas, and Jesus. As I mentioned before, this podcast is a form of my live show that ran in 2018 and 19 in New York City, and I'd like to come to your town. If you have a space or theater that would like to hold this show, let me know. The live show has original music and distinct chronicles. I mean, I didn't put all my material into this podcast. I saved some for the stage. You can also bring your friends that don't listen to podcasts, but do like some good live entertainment. Okay, enough housekeeping. On with the show. But first, a recap. Don't skip this part because there's some stuff you've probably forgotten, and it all comes together at the end. Oh, how it comes together at the end. In episode 1, my story started in Texas. You can't hide your lying eyes. It was a little background on me to set the stage. Sweet Christian virgin who was never rebellious or really that interesting. I graduated high school and headed east to college in New York, where I spread my wings but still remained sweet, Christian, and mostly virginal. It's a thing. In episode 2, I headed west to LA and fell in love with a preacher's son who asked me to marry him. I said yes before a surprise sunset cruise, and then 1 week later, the preacher's kid was in a near-fatal jet ski accident. The accident broke his femur, his groin, and his head. As he deteriorated in a Georgia hospital, I found myself outside on a wooden deck separating the wings of the hospital, asking myself if my fiancé was crazy, would I still marry him? And I answered, yes. And 4 months later, I stood before the PK's father who was marrying us and proclaimed the words, For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and health, in good times and bad, with as much confidence and gusto a person could have, because I knew my love had been tested and my love for James had won. Not 2 years later, my husband was making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, and we got pregnant as all our neighbors of similar age were having babies too. It was the perfect life. And when our beautiful son was 8 months old, my husband came home one day and told me he was leaving me for a Canadian, a younger, blonde Canadian. I told James to leave, and not 1 hour later, I'm calling the preacher's kid preacher father and asking him what to do. He told me no matter my decision, he'd help me. And I asked God the same question and got the same answer. Jennifer, it is your decision whether to file for divorce or fight for your marriage. But either way, I'll help you. I chose the latter. I chose to position myself for a miracle, not defeat.
But something happened for the very first time with you. My heart melts into the ground, found something true. And everyone's looking around, thinking I'm going crazy, baby.
And so in episode 3, I began the emotionally, immensely difficult decision to love my wayward husband as he spent $30,000 over the next several months on the woman from Canada. But James continued to pay the bills and come over every night to bathe our son Andrew and put him to bed. It was then I told myself if my husband ever came back, I'd write about it. I lost a shit ton of weight, started walking around the house naked, and prayed for hours every night God would bring my husband back. During that year, I formed a club called IGTS, I-G-T-S. I'm going through shit for people that were. We were comprised of like-minded women with husbands who'd left us and a belief in the God of miracles that he could do anything, including bringing prodigal husbands home. And in episode 4 and 5, my prodigal did come home. James and I embarked on the best year to 2 of our marriage, and in episode 6, we adopted a sweet Russian girl. During our time overseas, seeing the adoption through, I finished writing the memoir. I told myself if my husband ever came back, I'd write about it. So, sitting in a Siberian hotel 10 miles outside a Siberian orphanage where my soon-to-be daughter lived, I finished the memoir, but didn't know what to do with it. I knew I would publish it someday, but knew it wasn't ready to be published. I had nothing else to say, but knew the story wasn't over. But how could my story not be over? James had come home. I'd fought for my marriage and won. What else was there to say? I didn't know how to reconcile these contradictory thoughts, so I put the thoughts and the memoir aside and got to work tending my healed marriage and now 2 children home. I was busy, so it was all good. In episode 7, James and I decided to move back to my hometown in Texas because my family lived there and we knew we'd need help with 2 small children, especially one of them being a communist. Once we left the carefully erected scaffolding of our life in LA, we started to fall apart. And my husband, though not cheating on me anymore, became a rageful, psychopathic asshole. But I held on until another PK caught my eye and we began a heated sexting affair. It lasted several months. My husband found out, told me he was filing, and I cried out to God over my sin this time. Months passed, and my husband forgave me. Episode 8.
Oh, there were times that I thought I wouldn't last for long.
It was a new year, and God had told me something would happen at the beginning of the year. I thought this meant either James would come back to God and be the husband he used to be before his brain was bashed in, or that James would file. I didn't expect what God actually meant, and that was that I was going to meet a man that would change the course of my life, at least change the course of my marriage. His name was Robert, a married man from New York whom I'd kissed on stage in Texas 10 years prior, only now to be making out again on stage 10 years later naked. But I was still faithful to James and knew I would be, until one night in the middle of the run, James declared he was leaving me again. And this time, I called his bluff. After that horrible year he did leave me and subsequent years of him threatening to leave me again, I gave up fighting for my marriage and crawled my way into Robert's bed. He had a sexless, emotionally void marriage, so we found satisfying solace and rollicking romps during the short theater contract. I kissed Robert goodbye at the end of those 2 weeks, knowing I'd never see him again. Then, Robert was cast in another show in Texas for 3 months, right down the street from me. We had a torrid affair, him more reticent at first as he'd cheated on his wife before and knowing how these things often end, but I, being new to the affair game, wasn't looking for anything but a reprieve from my dying marriage. I convinced myself and Robert that having a little fling would be fine. It wouldn't last. I lived in Texas, he lived in New York. During the covert affair, we fell in love, but knew it wasn't going anywhere, so it didn't matter. Then my husband suggested the inconceivable. Let's get a second home in New York City.
Start spreading the news. I'm leaving today. I want to be a part of it. New York, New York.
Episode 9, I packed up half our house in the South and drove cross-country to put down roots in the Big Apple, where my lover lived and where my husband did not. My son and I weren't in New York 6 weeks before James filed for divorce, took our daughter BB, and fled to LA. I found myself all of a sudden in a new town with no job, no money, no prospects, going through a very complicated divorce, trying to raise my son alone, and now pay rent on an expensive Upper West Side apartment. I knew no one but Robert. But Robert was back with his wife and kids, and I was trying to figure out life. I saw him little, but he assured me our summer affair would be the first chapter of us, not the last. And so I waited and watched as he began slowly to unwind his 15 years of marriage. So, here we are, episode 10. At the top of a new year, I'm feeling peace for the first time in years. God had given me a dream on New Year's that Robert was a central character in my life and that God was working everything out. So, grab an empty glass and watch it shatter as the fat lady sings. Welcome to IGTS, Episode 10, Part 1. As I described at the end of last episode, at church 2 months prior, I had bumped into an old college friend named Armando, who fell madly in love with me and began wining and dining me all over the city. After 2 months of this, at the top of the year, Armando gave me a check for $3,000 because he knew I was struggling. He invited me to Paris Fashion Week and told me I could work for him. I wasn't really sure what that meant, but I figured it involved being arm candy for him on his business trips around the world as a successful, maybe gay, fashion writer. I enjoyed Armando's company, he enjoyed mine, and in the coming years I worked for him, he was never anything but a gentleman. I can't say enough about the blessing Armando was to me. Not only was he hiring me and paying me, he was also taking me all over the city, eating in the best restaurants, escorting me to the opera, taking me to museums and avant-garde shows, introducing me to exciting people at swanky galas, and reintroducing me to the city I loved and hadn't been in since college. All on his dime. And because Armando was in fashion, he bought me clothes and bags and jewelry constantly. To this day, I'm usually wearing or carrying something Armando gave me in the 2 years I worked for him. He flew me all over the world. I met with some of the most famous people on the planet, and I ended up helping him write a number of his books. I so wish I could have been in love with him. I so wish I could have, but I wasn't. I was in love with Robert. But Robert was gone most of the time, and so I became closer to Armando than anyone. I spent several nights a week with him, and it was great. In addition to my friendship with Armando, I also made a new friend named Charity. She was a mom from my son's first grade class, and one day in January, she approached me at drop-off and said, "Let's go get coffee." We sat down at Malecon, a Dominican coffee shop on 97th in Amsterdam, and she told me God told her to be my friend, that I needed a friend. I was surprised to meet a Christian like this in New York City. Charity was and is probably one of the godliest women I know. And if you think I have a salty mouth, you ain't heard Charity. She's a third Italian, a third Black, and 3/3 Puerto Rican. Once she was telling me a story about praying to Jesus about something, and she's going on and says, "And do you know what this motherfucker did? He totally answered my prayer. Hallelujah." And she waves her hand in the air and keeps talking a mile a minute in her New York Puerto Rican accent. And I stop her and I say, "Charity, did you just call Jesus a motherfucker?" "I sure did," she laughs and keeps going. Charity is the reason my son is currently at one of the greatest schools in New York. And Charity that first year taught me how to be alone. She didn't condemn me over my affair with Robert, but she also strongly pressed into me that I should be focusing on my son, not a man. The only man I needed was Jesus, she said, and that she, as a single mom of twins, with both of her parents dead, having survived a brain aneurysm when no one came to visit her at the hospital, she knew what being alone meant. And one day, as we talked in her apartment, as tears rolled down her face, she held mine and said, "I know how to be alone. It's okay, baby. God's got you." God had told me he was taking care of things. He was certainly taking care of me in these friendships, and the first month of the new year was certainly shaking out well. Not so with Robert. He came over the first night at the top of the new year sobbing. "My life can't be about trying to figure out how to leave my wife, Jenny. I don't see a world in which you and my kids exist. Financially, I don't see an out. Even if I had $1 million in the bank, I don't know what I'd do." I stood there in my bedroom watching him sob, not knowing how to respond. I wanted to reach out, grab him, hold him, but knowing I was the one bringing him this pain was confusing. I also didn't want to be hearing him saying these things. He loved me. He loved me. He had told me over and over for almost half a year that he would figure out how to get to me. I knew he was in love with me, but I also knew what was going on. Affairs survive by getting all needs met, split between two different people. That's the juice affairs subsist on. Met needs. Needs that aren't met at home. Needs that are met with a lover. That's not necessarily how affairs start, but it's certainly how they last. Robert wasn't getting his sexual or emotional needs met at home, but he was with me. And I hadn't been getting my emotional needs met at home, but I was with Robert. As long as we fulfilled those needs in each other's lives, and as long as our spouses were filling the other needs, we'd stay together forever. But when you want more than an affair, when you want the whole relationship, when you want the person to be your partner, then tensions arise. And this is why most affairs usually die. Because reality sets in, and you can't transfer all your needs onto one person without them becoming your life partner. And you can't transfer those needs from one partner to the next without going through a hell of a time. You have assets and kids and places of abode and friends and legalities and responsibilities that is hard work to rip from one and put onto another. And it eventually gets so freaking hard and complicated that the wayward spouse eventually throws up their hands and says, "This is too much. It'd be easier to work things out with the person I fell in love with and married than to try to pull that apart brick by brick and start building with a whole new person." I understood what this tension was. I knew it because I knew how affairs worked. I'd studied them for years as the waiting wife. I'd studied mistresses knowing the eventual missteps they make. And so now, as the mistress, I wasn't going to make those same mistakes. I knew what pressure and ultimatums do. They never drive a man toward you, but rather back into the arms of his wife. So I didn't pressure Robert. Not because I was clicking my nails together, cackling and calculating my actions to destroy his marriage. I just knew pressure wouldn't work, so I kept mum and waited, knowing if Robert and I were meant to be, we'd make it. And this freedom made him fall more in love with me and soldier on. I knew we'd find a way, just wasn't sure how long it would take. My love for Robert, this desire to be together, weighed heavily on my soul. This weight took a lot of my focus I should have had for my son Andrew. He was struggling too.
Honey, come here, I have something to tell you. It won't make things perfect, and it might not make sense, but someday you'll see it as clear as my smile. Do you know the word temporary? It means only for a little while.
A friend moves, a tooth aches, a pet dies, a toy breaks, the detours a life takes. I started to notice that he only talked and drew pictures of TV shows and computer games, because that's all he had for company. No real friends, no extracurricular activities, no father to play with, no sister, no grandparents, and no mother. And this is where I must pause and say that out of this entire saga of my life, my husband's betrayal, my husband's abuse, my sex affair with Bruce, my affair with Robert, the tearing apart of my family, Robert's tearing apart of his, me losing my daughter BB, me losing my marriage, the single point of pain that remains, the one and only one regret I have of my entire life is this: the personal neglect of my son. I'm an honest person. I'm a shameless person. I tell this story on stage to an audience, and I send out emails and podcasts and social media posts and tell the story about me being a mistress. But the one thing that I thrust down as hard as I can is the enormous guilt I feel over what I did to my son, or rather, what I didn't do. I didn't give him attention. I spent more time thinking about James and BB and now Robert than I did about Andrew. The first 3 years of Andrew's life was about James, and the next 3 were about BB, and now at 6 years old, I should have been focusing on my little boy. A little boy who watched his daddy leave and take his sister with him across to the other side of the country overnight. A little boy who'd come into his mom's room every day, year after year, to ask her to play with him or tell him a story, and was met with, "Hey, honey, I can't talk right now, but I'll be in 10 minutes. And the 10 minutes turned into 30, then 60, then 180 before she'd tell him to brush his teeth and get ready for bed with a promise that tomorrow she'd play with him. Out of those hundreds of promises, she fulfilled maybe 5. I'm not going to derail this whole story and make it about my gross failing as a mother. That's not what this podcast is about. But if there is one message I can shout as loudly from the undercurrents of an affair, it is this: do not neglect your child. No matter how fucked up your heart or brain is, no matter how frantically you're trying to keep things together or make money, you can afford 15 to 30 minutes of undivided attention to your children every day. It's not hard, and that's all they need. 15 to 30 minutes of undivided attention. That's all it would have taken to pour into my son's little hollowed-out soul. I could have filled it with love and affection. Instead, I filled it with nothing, and he spent many formative years alone with his stuffed animals. A playmate, a tear stain, a Christmas, a dad, the best times, the worst pain. Okay, self-flagellation over. But it needed to be said. I'm glad I'm a Christian because God promises that in all things he works for the good of those who love him. And I love him. And I'm asking him to restore the years the locusts have eaten. That's a Bible verse from the book of Joel. It's a pretty apt description. That February, I received transcripts from a forensic lab I had hired. The previous Thanksgiving, my daughter BB had come to New York to visit. As I was packing her bag then for her return to LA, I found James's cell phone in the front pocket of her little pink suitcase. James had mentioned losing his cell phone, and much to my delight and laughter, I realized little 4-year-old BB had taken it, put it in her suitcase, and James had no clue. Now I had his cell phone. I sent it to a forensic lab over the holidays and had just gotten the information back. I found all sorts of treasures. James had been with 2 more women in the first month Andrew and I had gone to New York. I found out that the reason James filed was to prove to the second one how much he liked her. That was rough. That was rough, seeing that the disillusion of my marriage was on par with some token of affection to prove to his escort girlfriend he met at a club in Vegas that he really liked her. That was what my divorce was to James. Brightly colored feathers, the mating call of a great horned owl, or the luring dance of a sandhill crane. And on James's phone, I found texts of James buying Coke. I know a lot of people do hard drugs, but James had smoked pot twice in his life. Now he's doing drug deals out of his home in LA? I also discovered James had set up a meeting with his dealer's dealer and was trying to deal cocaine himself. What in the world was happening? 2 more women and setting up deals with drug dealers to deal cocaine? Who in the hell was I married to? And could this information be helpful in my case? I was sick about it. As winter ended and spring began, life continued in the same manner. More divorce paperwork, more outings with Armando, Robert not around as much as I wanted, my son being sad over missing everyone, and me auditioning and getting nary a callback. Not to say I was unhappy. Oh no. Stressed, yes, but energized all the same. I was in New York and I was in love with Robert, and I no longer was under the thumb of James. These were all points of freedom, but they didn't come without huge price tags. Robert nor his wife had filed for divorce, but he told me things between them were continuing to unwind. I knew he wasn't dragging me on, rather just dragging the inevitable out.
Jolene, 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 I'm begging of you, please don't take my man. Your beauty is beyond compare, with flaming locks of auburn hair, with ivory skin and eyes of emerald green. Jolene, 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 please don't take him just because you can.
So, now we get to the real crux of the matter. There's one person I've left out so far in this tale, haven't I? I didn't forget. Oh no. I've been saving her for the end, because she's the reason why I couldn't sail into the guilt-free sunset with Robert. Because Robert had a wife. Why did the man I love have to have a wife? Kate. Kate was her name. Kate is her name. How could I have an affair knowing what I knew, having been on the other side and fighting from the other side for so long? How could I as a Christian do this? How could I do to another woman what I had fought so hard against for years? Kate wasn't a bad woman. She wasn't cheating on Robert. She wasn't abusing him. But she wasn't having sex with him either. Maybe because I forced myself to have sex with an asshole on a weekly basis, I had no tolerance for someone who didn't have sex with a decent man on a monthly basis. Maybe because I had fought so hard for my marriage, I didn't have patience for wives who crapped out on theirs. Maybe I thought the only ones deserving of a good marriage were people who put forth the effort. In the world of justification gymnastics, I was becoming a gold medalist. When Robert and I first started our affair, I was reeling from my husband leaving me again. And when I learned not only had Robert's wife not cared about his infidelity 10 years before me, but that she also hadn't cared for sex with Robert their entire marriage, I saw our affair as strangely needed, predicted, and acceptable. And it wouldn't go anywhere, so who cares? But when I got to New York, it was a whole new game, because I had grown to want Robert in a real way, and he had grown the same. Yet, when James filed for divorce so quickly, that shifted Robert and my timeline. Robert wasn't ready to match my readiness for our relationship. He and his wife hadn't even had conversations about separating. So now our divorce trajectories were way off at this point. And this would lead me to do some serious digging about what exactly was going on in his marriage. I knew Robert's wife didn't know about me, but what did she think about their current marriage? Was she fighting for it? Was she aware Robert was turning away with no intention of trying to salvage it this time? Robert didn't know why I was so inquisitive beyond just a curiosity of he and his wife's dynamic, but my questions were for one purpose only: to make sure I wasn't fighting another woman for her man. I had no interest in that, but I would take a man whose wife didn't want him. And from the sound of things, both had been going through the marriage motions for quite a while, and now that Robert had found me, he had reason to end the charade. And to be fair, Kate was no innocent lamb. Maybe she'd been faithful to Robert, but once upon a time before she married him, she'd had an affair with a married man. An actor who ironically had played Jesus in Jesus Christ Superstar. So another part of me thought, I'm now doing to Kate what I'm sure a certain wife many moons ago had wished upon her. Yeah, that's harsh, but true. Karma's a bitch. And so I continued to wait for Robert, to see what he'd eventually do. And as bizarre as this sounds, I found myself wanting Kate to fight for her marriage. And several times I'd encourage Robert to fight for her. This always confused him. How could I be sleeping with him and in the same breath suggest he end things with me and fix his marriage? Because I told him I was a wife first. I believe in marriage. I wouldn't be the woman you fell in love with if I didn't hold this tenacious belief that marriage is sacred and marriages can be restored. And as time went on, I slowly began to realize why I'd felt that internal hiccup 3 years before in a Siberian hotel writing my memoir, that it wasn't time to publish, because my marriage would eventually fail and that book couldn't be written. But I still had a story to tell, because now, as the mistress, I was seeing the same things, but from a totally different perspective. All the stories I read about the husband and mistress fighting, or the mistress wondering about the wife and what she's like and stalking her on social media. Apparently, Kate is like the greatest wedding planner in New York City. And how the husband has his doubts and still loves his wife and may be in love with the mistress, but he's still torn. All of the things I read about mistresses and affairs were true. I was living it. And both vantage points led me to the same conclusion, that the wife really does have the upper hand. Look, mistresses are a dime a dozen. It takes very little to become one. You have to have a vagina and be willing to let a married man put his penis there. Voila, you're a mistress. But to be a wife, that takes so much time and engagement. There is a lot of investment involved. That's so much more than a penis finding its way to you. If Kate could see that, maybe she'd do things differently. But she wasn't doing things differently, at least not what I could gather. As spring ended and summer began, life continued in the same manner. More divorce paperwork, more outings with Armando, Robert not around as much as I wanted, my son being sad over missing everyone, and me auditioning and getting nary a callback. June rolled around and BB flew in for the month. I was really looking forward to spending time with my daughter. It had been 9 months since she was in my care. The first day BB was with me, we took Andrew to school and then came home, ready to start our mommy-daughter day together. I opened her pink suitcase and my jaw dropped. Every single piece of clothing was either dirty, had holes, or was too small. There was not one new item of clothing. My daughter was 4.5. Kids grow at alarming rates, and the only clothes were ones that I had bought her a year ago. Even her underwear was old, all permanently stained with a brown film. I deduced that every morning James would stick our daughter in the backyard and let her play, covering herself in dirt. Even her toothbrush was old. It was the same one I had bought last summer, only this summer it was frayed. A 12-month-old toothbrush. I was mortified. James had personally donned new outfits and bags every time I'd seen him over the 9 months, but never BB. I thought nothing of it at the time, however, since I would only see her for a couple of days. Now, here was a suitcase of her entire wardrobe and not one piece of clothing that was clean or without holes or properly fitting her little growing body. I called my mother, mostly to bitch, but also to try to gain support. She had so readily taken James aside our entire marriage and even over the course of our divorce. Her main issue was always the kids. She didn't give a shit if James was a shitty husband, but if he was a shitty dad, well, maybe that'd get her attention. She didn't seem shocked, though, when I broke the news about the bag of despair, as I called it. She chirped that she'd figured as much since whenever she'd babysit BB after I'd left for New York and before James moved to LA, that her fingernails were always dirty or her hair was never brushed. She even recalled the housekeeper almost vomiting when she found maggots in the trash can. The housekeeper also reported that BB's little potty was full of pee and hadn't been changed in days whenever she'd come over to clean. No one had told me any of this. My God, Mom, he has all this money, yet won't provide for her basic needs? He'll spend money on himself and take trips with his girlfriend, but won't buy his daughter underwear? He claims it's because he has no money, but I know that's not true. Oh, I know, Jennifer. I know he's hiding money. Wait, what do you mean? He told me. Oh, you know, I've already told you this. No, Mom, you haven't. Yes, I have. Okay, well, humor me, Mom. What did James say? Ugh, she sighed. Well, it was last year during the time when, Well, the time you and I weren't talking because you were mad at me, and well, I'm sorry, but James was saying how many problems the two of you were having and that you might get divorced, and I commented, well, James, I hope you can find a place to stash your money so Jennifer can't get a hold of it, and he said, oh, Ann, don't worry, I already have. You said what to James? You told him you hoped he would hide money from me? Well, yes, well, you make it sound so bad. It's just, you wouldn't talk to me and he would, so I kind of took a side, but it wasn't a big deal. I already told you all of this. You already knew this. No, Mom. No, I didn't. I gotta go. And I hung up the phone. I knew my mom didn't have a lot of love for me, but this was a new low. I called Robert numb. He told me he felt like he'd been punched in the gut, and that if he felt that way, he could only imagine what I felt. He told me even if I fucked the entire Dallas Cowboys football team, a parent should stick by their child. He wished for me that someday I would be Teflon, as I accepted this was how it was always going to be with my mother, that I wouldn't be surprised. Then he said I didn't deserve to be treated this way, and that it only made him love me more. The kids flew the next month to LA to be with their dad. And that same month, Robert and his wife agreed to separate. It had been 1 year since our summer affair began. Robert would still live at the house, but they decided their marriage should end and to start the unwinding. Robert moved into the attic, but wasn't there long, for he landed a new Broadway show and rehearsals were out of town for the entire summer. I flew to see Robert in Chicago that July. The week I visited him was everything. We went to Wrigley Field, took an architecture cruise through downtown, and one day as we lay in bed, Robert started singing a song. I'd never heard it before. What is that? I asked. It's a song I wrote called Crayola Girl, he said. Crayola Girl? Who did you write it for? Nobody specific, he said. I wrote it when I was about 25, about the girl I wanted to marry someday. Coloring with crayons what she'd look like with her caramel hair and chestnut eyes, he said as he knowingly looked into my matching colors. I immediately jumped up from the bed and walked into the other room. Jenny? Jenny? A couple minutes later, I returned back into the bedroom and held out 3 crayons I'd made in the Crayola Museum with my kids just 1 month before. You can make your own crayons there and label them whatever name you want. I had made 3 Crayolas for Robert and labeled them. I named one of them Songs for Jenny. We both sat there staring at the Crayola in my hand, in the hand of Robert's Crayola girl. I flew back to New York and found a new place to live when my lease expired. I couldn't afford the expensive Upper West Side apartment, so I moved uptown to Harlem, found a cute little 2-bedroom with large windows in the master bedroom that opened into sunshine, and at night the street lamps would fill the room with a warm glow. Robert and I would lay in bed and call it the Tennessee Williams room, because that's what it looked like, a room right out of a Tennessee Williams play. Robert's Broadway show opened that fall, but I wasn't invited to go with him. He took his wife. I was sad, but understood. Kate had accompanied Robert to every Broadway opening he'd done for 15 years. He wasn't ready to let his personal life explode all over his professional life at this point. He wasn't going to promenade in with a mistress on his arm. But despite his attempts to keep me in the wings that night, on opening night, my presence walked center stage and took the spotlight. Because that night after the show, Robert accidentally left his phone out, and Kate saw all his texts to me. She finally knew. I'd been begging Robert to come clean and tell her that the lies were almost worse than the actual affair. Well, now she knew. Robert had had suspicions she'd had an affair that summer, and it's why she'd been willing to end the marriage. Maybe now they could both come clean. I continued not to put pressure on Robert, but my God, it was excruciating. I knew he was moving toward me. I knew my life was just as messy and complicated, but my stomach was in knots every day, every hour, really. I continued to journal and write, knowing that I did indeed have much more to say as I'd felt in that Siberian hotel years ago. But what would be the end point? I knew my story couldn't be about whether or not Robert and I made it. That's not what my story was about. It was about marriage reconciliation. And even as the mistress, I still knew this was at the heart of everything. But how exactly did that story end? I wasn't sure. So I just kept loving Robert, wringing my spiritual hands. What the hell was I doing? Plunging the knife in my own heart deeper and deeper, knowing one day it would be clear when I could finish the prayer and say, the end. Finish this story and say, Amen.
Take me to church, I'll worship like a dog at the shrine of your life. I'll tell you my sins so you can sharpen your knife. Offer me that death stuff, good God, let me give you my life.
And this is the end of episode 10, part 1, The Fat Lady Sings. I'm a little over a year into New York at this point, guts strewn across my floor, body bedraggled across my bed. I'd given my everything to these two men, body, soul, mind, and strength. And in January of this next year, 1.5 years after my husband filed for divorce, and 2 years after my affair began, it is over. Wait, what is over? Tune in next episode, episode 10, part 2. Amen, to find out. This is She Bangs, Marriage, Adultery, Texas, and Jesus. Find me on Twitter at Jennifer Bangs or shebangsbangs.com. Cheers. Until next time.